Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, July 15th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about Republican candidate for Senate Kari Lake in the state of Arizona, and a recent decision from her campaign asking the Arizona Supreme Court to declare her the state's governor despite her election loss back in 2022. Now, for a while, we have been talking about Kari Lake and her run against Ruben Gallego, the presumptive Democratic nominee for Senate here. Neither primaries have occurred, in which she is running behind him by roughly 2 points across the state, losing 3 out of the 4 most recent polls in this battleground state. Now, Arizona's Senate races come in at a unique point because it serves as a prime opportunity for Republicans to expand their seats in the U.S. Senate and potentially even win back Senate control through the state of Arizona. It's one of the major states that has been under scrutiny right now with Democratic incumbents. Currently speaking, we have Kyrsten Sinema, who is the incumbent here, decided not to run for re-election. She's actually an independent who caucuses with the Democratic Party. But Kari Lake has been vying for this Senate seat long before Kyrsten Sinema had even decided that she was not running for re-election. And it was the next move for Kari Lake after her loss in the 2022 governor election. For full context as to where this even comes from in the first place, and her asking of the Arizona Supreme Court dates back to 2022, when she ran for governor and lost against then Secretary of State Katie Hobbs by a margin of less than 1 percentage point. Now, Arizona was amongst the closest governor races in the entire nation back in 2022. But what was actually more infuriating for the Kari Lake campaign, and arguably for Republicans both statewide and nationwide, was that Kari Lake was practically the presumptive governor for a while when you take a look at the numbers and what the pundits had said about this race. When you take a look at the Senate, the governor races, even the forecast here had Kari Lake up. In FiveThirtyEight, Kari Lake was up 2.4% across the state against Katie Hobbs. On Real Clear Politics, she was up by 3.5%. And again, we were coming off the 2020 election year where Biden had been leading Trump across the state by 3 to 4 points, only to end up winning by roughly 0.3. And so the expectation here, wide expectation, practically across everybody, including Democrats and Republicans in the state, was that Katie Hobbs was going to lose because the polls typically underestimate Republicans in Arizona. The last race here was in 2018. We saw that the Republicans won the state by 14 points in 2018, and so it wouldn't be too unreasonable to think that Republicans were on track for at least a 4-point victory in the Arizona governor's race. But on Election Day, that did not end up happening. And so when I say everybody had predicted this, I mean everybody. You look at the FiveThirtyEight forecast too, Kari Lake had a 68% chance of victory here. And to put things into perspective too, Katie Hobbs was far from a stellar candidate when it came down to this individual Senate race. Based on many people's understandings of the campaign, both internally and externally, it did not look like this Arizona governor's race was going to go to the Democratic Party. Katie Hobbs refused to debate Kari Lake. Katie Hobbs did not hold as many rallies by far as Kari Lake and had a very minimal presence on the campaign trail, contrary to her Republican opponent. But Kari Lake had something that Katie Hobbs did not, and that was a level of unpopularity and far-right extremism associated with her name that, quite frankly, Arizona voters did not want to stomach. She was absolutely unapologetically pro-life in every instance in the state of Arizona, in a state where arguably the decision around abortion was prevalent following the Dobbs decision and absolutely mattered with a state legislature that was controlled by Republicans. And thus, Democrats would arguably be the temper to that Republican legislature in the event an abortion ban was to take place statewide. On top of that, too, we find that Kari Lake adopted many different strategies that just quite frankly are not effective for swing state candidates. Things where she was denying the 2020 election even through the 2022 election. An election that had no bearing on what was going to happen in her in the governorship. She was adamant that Donald Trump had the election stolen from him, and she refused to concede that race, and voters really didn't like that. And beyond many other topics where she adopted far-right extremist policies, voters eventually said that she should not be the next governor of the state of Arizona. And very similar to former President Donald Trump, completely came out and said that the election was stolen from her, going so far to a point where now she's being sued by a Republican county commissioner. The Maricopa County Board of Elections had a Republican elected by the county itself, is now suing Kari Lake, at which she is pleading no contest. And so when she decided that she was not going to concede, she went across the state of Arizona, went nationally. She struck this out through December, January, February of the next year, and she even to this day has not conceded this 2022 governor election, citing that this election was in fact stolen, thus making this new move to ask the Arizona Supreme Court to declare her the state governor. Now, this is a move that I really cannot reconcile, or I really can't wrap my head around why somebody who's in a position where they're running 2 points behind the Democratic opponent thinks that this in any way could help them. Even if she wasn't stated as governor, which is not going to happen, even if she wasn't stated as governor, nobody would see it as a legitimate decision. I mean, if anything, this would just validate the claims that a Supreme Court is out of touch and aligned with Republicans more than Democrats, the same thing that the American public already believes about where we are today on the national level, they will also believe on the statewide level. And I think that Kari Lake is hoping, because the Arizona Supreme Court upheld a draconian abortion law ban that had taken place and passed before Arizona was even a state, that came into effect, that the Arizona Supreme Court had ruled essentially that this was permissible. Kari Lake here is probably trying to appeal to them and say, make me the governor so there's some level of incumbency advantage, but nobody would even see it that way. And I can guarantee you the Arizona Supreme Court will not be making Kari Lake the next governor of the state of Arizona. This is something that has been tried, litigated before, failed on the Kari Lake part in the same way that it failed on the Donald Trump part. Arizona did not have a stolen race in 2020, and quite frankly in 2022 certainly did not. In neither of those instances did the Republican nominees, for whatever it might be, have the election stolen from them. They just rightfully lost their races here. And so what Kari Lake is trying to do here is that her attorney, Jennifer Wright, is trying to go to the Supreme Court and say that this election was flawed. 2022 was fundamentally flawed in the way that they approached this election. And so, future elections are threatened. The court needs to intervene. And so what she's trying to do here is essentially just say that this was wrong in Maricopa County, this county right here with Phoenix, with the majority of the state's vote comes from, where they're going to say, a bunch of different things happened, that people were unfairly, going through the ballots and switching them over to Democrats, that people weren't allowed to vote, so many different things. I mean, you saw the same thing happen in 2020 where they had to count the ballots 5 times in Arizona. And voters were exhausted. I mean, we saw the approval rating in the states of Arizona dip for Donald Trump, dip for Republicans overall, dip for Republican nominees and candidates for future races, when during the 2022 midterms, I kid you not, through the 2022 midterms, Arizona and Maricopa County were still counting the ballots from 2020. Why? The state legislature was controlled by Republicans. Donald Trump was calling in a favor, and they spent countless taxpayer dollars, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to do these audit after audit after audit after audit after audit, and found out for the 5th time that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election in the state of Arizona. And so Kari Lake tried to do this again, based on the numbers here. I believe she forced for a recount. Overall, though, we found that Kari Lake did, in fact, lose the governor election, but now she's trying to win it back, and it really doesn't make sense to me, if I'm being entirely honest with you. I think I've seen this race as one where Kari Lake has tried to, in a way, distance herself from her past. I mean, when she initially announced, a lot of the media coverage was that she was an election denier. The way that she had approached the 2022 midterms and the response to it was one that seemed to be invalidating for her to run for Senate in the first place. But then the National Republican Party cleared the field for her in the Senate race here. You can see that there were plenty of other options that could have ran. People like Doug Ducey, the incumbent governor, who had a high approval rating, who Donald Trump despised, decided not to run for Senate in this race because he thought he was going to lose, because Donald Trump practically said if Doug Ducey gets in this race, Doug Ducey was the governor who oversaw Donald Trump losing the state of Arizona. If Doug Ducey enters into the race, I might as well campaign for the Democrat. It was a very strong threat from the former president. And so people realized, Kelly Ward realized, Karen Taylor Robson realized, Blake Masters, Abe Hamadeh, all of them realized that nobody was going to challenge Kari Lake, and that she was Donald Trump's darling child, and that he was going to push her across to victory in the Republican primary, and they're better off running for something else or not running for Senate at all. And so we found that the National Republican Party agreed. They decided to step out of the way, clear the field for her, and Kari Lake is now easily the presumptive nominee for Senate in the state of Arizona, and this completely makes Democrats in a much more favorable position when it comes down to winning this race. But I think my main problem with this is that this could not have come at a worse time for Kari Lake. I mean, all she needed to do was just run just a few points behind former President Trump, and she could have had this Senate race practically in the bag. I mean, had she completely changed her opinions from 2022, become a far more centrist candidate, a more moderate, a more understanding Republican and conservative, voters would have actually appreciated that. I think Kari Lake really messed up in many ways over the past year by sticking to her guns about the 2020 election, sticking to her guns about the 2022 election, sticking to her stances on abortion. I mean, she changed a few things, but largely speaking, she is the same person. And I get it. You're running just 2 years later, less than a year later, after you lose a governor race, you're announcing that you're running for Senate. It's not always the best look to flip-flop, but there's honestly something that voters do appreciate in understanding that your opinions on one end were not popular, and thus you need to shift with the public. People saw it happen with the Obama-Biden administration on gay marriage. People saw it with the Republican Party on different issues over the past 20 years. Voters make people realize, make politicians realize that sometimes, just sometimes, and in this instance, it absolutely was true, your opinions and your stances are reasons you lose elections. Kari Lake, arguably, is a very palatable person when it comes down to the way she campaigns. She was a TV anchor. She was someone who does very well at rallies. She inspires a crowd. She, at one point in time, had she won the governorship, was in high contention to be Donald Trump's VP. I mean, they were talking about a Trump-Lake ticket far out because everyone thought she was going to win the governorship and assumed, had she done that, based on her performance and campaign style, based on the way that she had relayed herself to voters, that she could, in fact, go on to be Donald Trump's VP. Obviously, that didn't happen because she wasn't elected governor, but had she been there, I mean, she would have been someone who would have been able to really capture in that Trump vibe in a swing state, and it would have been a super easy pick. I could have imagined it yesterday that Trump would have picked Kari Lake, but I think what we're looking at today is a decision that could really mark the end of a Senate bid that might have otherwise been successful. I don't think Kari Lake was ever the favorite in the Senate race, but I think she would have fared far better had she not made consistent mistakes. It isn't just this. Kari Lake has largely been embroiled in scandal. She skips out of the Arizona Senate GOP debate, the same thing she critiqued her Democratic opponent for back in 2022. This time around, Ruben Gallego will certainly be using that as ammunition. She campaigns in front of a Confederate flag. There's no response. There's no apology. Really, you just find that Kari Lake distances herself in some cases, but in other cases really doesn't respond to many of the things that she's being attacked for, under scrutiny for, and that's honestly a big problem. And now most recently, going to the Arizona Supreme Court to go so far as to declare her the state governor. I mean, I kid you not, the decision here says that, you need to overturn the 2022 results for not only this election, but for future ones, and saying that the way that they're counting the ballots is wrong, the way they're approaching elections is wrong. I mean, this is really a strategy you find of someone who is such a sore loser. They're trying to elevate it so far up that they're trying to find anyone to cling on to it and agree with them. And in every case, she has been shut down. And so I fully expect the Arizona Supreme Court to shut it down, but I cannot imagine the Democratic Party has not already jumped on this as ammunition. This was 2 days ago that she filed the motion to do this. And I just genuinely cannot understand why someone would do this just months out from your Senate bid, months out, even before your primary, before you're even chosen as the nominee, to try to overturn a past election. Because she can no longer distance herself in any capacity from her remarks around 2022. She can no longer distance herself in any regard around any of her election denialism, and that is a fundamental problem. Because voters rejected that before. And even now, they are likely to choose Trump in 2024, but are still not choosing her in the Senate race. Because she has become so exceptionally unpopular and so exceptionally unpalatable for voters that Donald Trump is 7 points ahead of where she is right now. Donald Trump is running nearly 8 points ahead of the presumptive Republican nominee for Senate, and the reason for that is that although she may capture him in, and although Donald Trump in his own right may be an election denialist, the way that we would describe it, I would say that is a fair characterization. At the same time, Kari Lake is no Donald Trump. And she tried to be him in 2022. She adopted even further extremist policies than what Donald Trump would do. She makes Project 2025 look like child's play in the way that she would adopt strategy and conservative thoughts for Arizona in the governor election and also in the United States Senate. And so voters have really picked up on that. And Kari Lake comes in as this really unlikable and unpopular candidate and has done absolutely nothing except hurt her image even more. She has consistently given the Democratic Party ammunition to use against her in the Senate race. It has become a major problem for all of these Republican nominees who continuously double down on things that have made them unpopular in the first place. I'm not just thinking about the Arizona Senate race. I'm thinking about the many other Senate races where we have seen the Republican Party really not coming together and put forth their best foot. I mean, you're thinking about the races here. Take a look at states like Ohio. Bernie Moreno, the worst candidate that Republicans could have nominated, and guess what? They nominated him. Eric Hovde in the state of Wisconsin, not a strong candidate. Dave McCormick in the state of Pennsylvania, not a strong candidate. You are finding that Republicans across the country are making the same exact mistake they did in 2022, and that's trying to replicate Donald Trump but failing to do so, doubling down on policies and statements and positions and scandals that make them unpopular, and they are going to go on to lose many of these races, not because Republicans can't win them, but because these specific Republicans can't win them. It's not a major problem with the party in the sense that the party itself is dragging them down. These individual candidates, had they just acted with a little bit more prim and posture and came into this race with far less extremism, they would have been easily able to win numerous Senate elections, but that is not the current state of the GOP. That is not the current state of these candidates, and arguably may not be what is palatable to primary voters. And so they need to adopt these more extreme policies now, but don't have enough time to shift to the center. And decisions like this from Kari Lake, I can only sum up in being a huge and horrible political decision. One that, again, I've said this before, could very well mark the end of a Senate bid that would have otherwise had hope in different circumstances for Kari Lake. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.